Hello, and welcome to the History of Orchestration Volume 3. This is the third in the series of videos, and I'd suggest at least watching Volume 2 before this video. It will give you a lot of context for a discussion of Wagnerian orchestration. I've linked it in the eye and in the description box below. Today we will be talking about the art of orchestration after Wagner. Wagner was like a bomb in the world of orchestration. It went off and totally changed the playing field for composers. Some composers went with the Wagnerian orchestration and took it to new levels, and some rejected it completely. We will see both examples today. Wagnerian orchestration was thick, had winds in threes or fours, extended brass, and string parts that used a lot of Debussy, or separation of parts. Another feature of Wagnerian writing was the constant movement of all the orchestra parts. Very little of the orchestra was static. There were parts stacked on top of one another, moving in different directions, giving you a sense that the orchestra was crawling forward under its own power. The obscurity of the parts and the size of the orchestra was beyond what some composers could write for. Many European orchestras could not draw on the diversity or number of instrumentalists needed for Wagnerian orchestration. Franz Liszt was foremost among the Wagnerian sympathizers. His success in the concert hall spread the gospel of Wagnerian orchestration to other parts of Europe. Known for his brilliant orchestral effects, most of his Wagnerianisms can be found in his tone paintings. One of the biggest names to reject the sumptuousness and luxury of Wagner was Johannes Brahms. He can be said to have followed the spirit of Beethoven and Schumann in his orchestrations. He loved to split the lower strings, dividing the celli and the basses into many parts, and pairing them with the horns. The upper string parts are always moving, filled with double stops or polyphonic writing. The woodwinds usually double themselves throughout, with sections taking solos instead of singular instruments. His strings and woodwinds are considered equally powered, passing melodic material back and forth. He uses his brass as if they were in Beethoven's time, ignoring the new valved instruments. Trumpets hardly get melodic or chromatic material, and the horns have short moments of solo that stay close together on the staff. Brahms loves using the strings, woodwinds, and horns as one unit, using this combination as his neutral tone. Brahms also loved to play with meter and set things on different parts of the beat. In some of his compositions, he completely obscures the beat for several measures, just to come back to it. The opening of Brahms Symphony No. 1 is characteristic of his symphony writing. The opening is scored for woodwinds and strings, with the melody in the first violins, second violins, and celli crawling up the register, and the woodwinds crawling down. The beat is obscured in the string parts, while it's reiterated in the repeating timpani pulse. Let's hear it now. The next extension to the Wagnerian model was Richard Strauss. He brought the theatrical effects of Wagner to the concert hall in his tone poems. He used many effects that were only known as exceptional and belonging to the theater. His Debussy in the strings exploded until each desk of two was playing its own part. The growing contrapuntal complexity of Strauss's music required a new idea of what a 2D orchestra sounded like. He would have to double the melody at the octave or in another part to make sure the balance was correct for the work. This leads to some unusual doublings, such as having the trumpets and the trombones double the strings in legato or smooth playing sections so the parts had enough power. Strauss adds multiple contrapuntal interests to create his extended harmonic worlds, instead of relying on the backing power of woodwinds, which would be normal for Beethoven or Brahms. Extended techniques like tremolo on artificial harmonics, portamento in both strings and the woodwinds, muting for all brass instruments including the tuba, groups of brass given shakes to play, tongue tremolo in the brass instruments, tongue tremolo in the woodwinds, extended percussion including wind machines, cowbells, and others all make an appearance in Strauss's work. Strauss's poem, Till Eulenspiegel's Merry Pranks, is an example of his wide-ranging orchestration. Let's take a look at it. We drop into the piece already in progress, with the winds and strings cascading in undulating runs, ending in trills for the woodwinds. The horns, along with the trombones, violas, and the celli, have a thrilling theme that moves upward before coming down. The trumpet has a thundering rhythm, giving this a military flavor. The second stanza has the oboes joining in, and there is a switch between the celli and the violins, the latter joining forces with the theme. It terminates in a staccato section that sounds like riding a horse, with pizzicato in the strings and staccato articulations in the winds. The horn plays the till theme over and over. The section transitions to a flute solo, playing wildly while the rest of the orchestra accompanies. The oboes and the horns pass the till theme between them. The strings and the woodwinds layer in to create an orchestral crescendo, dissipating immediately. The celli, basses, bassoons, and bass clarinet have a rising melody, fighting for prominence with the downward figuration in the woodwinds. The orchestra has another huge crescendo, with parts going everywhere, until it conglomerates into 4 tutti notes, the last one held. This is the zenith of the section. The orchestra then returns to the rollicking horse figurations, this time with the strings arco or playing with the bow. The trombones and the bassoons have a massive upward scale, leading the entire orchestra into a section of chaos, with all the members playing accented eighth notes. This is Till being chased by the authorities. This then leads into a section of martial rhythm, with the overarching horn melody. This is abruptly interrupted by a large tutti staccato chord that leads to a drum roll on a snare drum. Till has been caught and is being led to the gallows. The brass, including bassoons, play dire chords like the charges being read. The strings and the horns come in on the offbeats to add even more sinister flavor. This is interrupted by the D clarinet playing the Till theme as if Till is trying to argue with the authorities. This then goes back and forth between the brass and their ominous chords and the D clarinet playing the Till theme, mimicking an argument between Till and the authorities. The last interruption by the Till theme is in the highest register of the D clarinet, almost squeaking, illustrating Till's rising terror. This ends with a circular motion in the horns, trumpets, and upper strings, like a noose being wound around Till's neck. The bassoons, horns, and low brass play 2 notes, a major 7th part, landing on the low G flat as one more final rebuke. The D clarinet plays a longer version of Till's theme, ending up in that squeaky register again. The oboes, English horn, and D clarinet scale down the staff, as if to play out a slow motion fall of Till's body from the platform. The section ends with a few low chords, pizzicato in the strings, as Till dies. Strauss's use of extended orchestral techniques brought the techniques used in opera into the concert hall and used them to tell a complete story. Let's hear that section now. Try to follow the high points of the orchestration as the excerpt plays. opposite of Strauss during this period was Claude Debussy. Debussy was an impressionist who relied on creating a mood and an atmosphere instead of direct tone painting. You will not find music that correlates directly to action in Debussy's music, unlike what we saw in the Strauss. Debussy's orchestra is wrought in finely detailed tone color, using the orchestra like a painter's palette. Impressionists like Debussy also used harmony as timbre, using new chord combinations, ambiguous tonality, modes and exotic scales, parallel motion, and other effects to generate an overall mood or feeling. Debussy would divide the string group into multiple parts, sometimes playing at odds with one another. One section would be playing muted, another group not. He also used some strings playing pizzicato while others played arco, using the string harmonics to stack chords and the tremolo to create tension. Most of his string writing is not loud but very reserved. The woodwinds speak in thin melodic lines for solo voices, sometimes blended in groups, both overlapping and picking up the threads of harmony or melody, one from another, with carefully concealed joints. He delighted in the tone quality of low flutes and high bassoons, using them extensively in his orchestrations. Brass voices in Debussy's works are often muted and rarely heard at full strength. Sometimes they hold soft, sustained chords for long times. The trumpets are chromatically active, injecting some chromaticism in between melodic groups. The brass as a group just occasionally flares up into brilliance for a moment, perhaps a second or two in the whole work, and then subsides. Debussy also has light touches with percussion instruments as well. He uses hardly audible rolls on the cymbal or light, elusive touches on the side drum, just to vanish as fast as they appeared. Debussy's work Prélude après Midi d'un Faune demonstrates most of his striking characteristics at the very top of the work. The work is opened by a famous flute solo, starting on a C sharp and descending a tritone to a G natural. The scale is somewhat chromatic, and the whole melodic cell is in the low range for the flute. Then the oboes, clarinets, and horns come in with a sustained piano chord, while the harp does a mildly discordant arpeggio. The time signature goes from 9/8 to 6/8, shortening each measure, while the horns waffle around a few tones and the harp does another glissando. The strings hold out pianissimo chords, muted. The score goes back to 9/8 when the flute comes in again, with the same melodic fragment as the opening. The strings are all playing tremolo, except for the basses, all sur la touche, or over the fingerboard. This gives the strings a very airy feeling because the instruments are less resonant when played over the fingerboard. The horns undulate again, and the melody is handed off to the oboe. Debussy then writes an orchestral crescendo by phrasing in the clarinets and the bassoons, having the first violins drop out of the tremolo, and the rest of the strings start playing naturally. As the crescendo awakens, the first violins join the oboes and the clarinets to double the melody in octaves. Once at the forte, Debussy has the orchestra crescendo in waves, with 3/8 notes to a crescendo, dropping back before starting the next crescendo. This creates the sensation of waves breaking on the shore. The orchestra drops out and leaves a solo clarinet to play the melodic material again until it releases into repetition of the opening. This work is totally different than anything Wagner or his contemporaries could write. It is primarily played piano or softly, with a small section forte or loudly, before dipping back to piano again. The tonality is not straightforward but undulates with the melodic material. Let's listen and watch the opening of this work so we can delight in Debussy's sound world. The story of orchestration branches off from here. There are many different paths for a composer to take, whether the maximalist Wagnerian style, the minimalist Debussy style, or somewhere in between. The history of orchestration is vast and relied on the composition of the orchestra itself. Orchestras grew from mixed pickup bands with unknown instrumentation to orchestras of great numbers, totaling upwards of 100. Every advancement in instrument technology led to new ways to shape and sound the instrument in the orchestra. Each of these instruments went from a one-size-fits-all approach to an individualized approach, where each instrument was used as a color on a painter's palette. Thank you for joining me in this third installment of the History of Orchestration series. I had a lot of fun and learned a lot from putting these videos together, and I hope you have fun and learned a lot too. Please subscribe and make sure you don't miss an upload. You can also support the creation of these videos on Patreon. There's a link in the description box below. The bibliography for this video is posted on my website, dominiqueroyam.com. A link to it is in the description box. Let's continue this conversation about orchestration on social media. You can find me as Dominique Royam everywhere. Thanks so much, and see you in my next video.